Hello and welcome. Now we are going to discuss those questions in the GS2 section of this year's GS2 paper of this year's main examination, which belong to international relations. Now, first things first, every year, as the trend is, the UPSC has been asking questions from international relations. There are 4 questions from international relations. This year also that trend continues. There were 2 questions worth 10 marks to which you had to write an answer in 150 words. And then there were 2 questions of 15 marks for which you had to write an answer in 250 words. And that's the requirement, that simple requirement that UPSC had set before you. Now, this makes for a total of 50 marks out of the 250 marks in the paper. Now let's look at the questions first and mark them as they correspond to the syllabus as defined by the UPSC. What areas were covered by the UPSC, and then we'll talk about some of the trends if we can talk about them. Alright. So the first question, if you would see, appeared as serial number 9 in the examination. Critically examine the role of WHO, World Health Organization, in providing global health security during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now you have to answer it in 150 words. So that's the first thing that should basically be of concern to you, that you don't have to get swayed by the amount of information that has been in the public sphere about the WHO throughout the year. You have to structure an answer and you have to display the best of information that you had, and the part of the syllabus that this particular question catered to was important international institutions, agencies and fora, their structure and mandate. And again, if you see over the years, this is one part of the syllabus which has contributed to at least a question, one question in the examination. Now this does not tell you much, but organizations remain important, specifically those under the umbrella of what is called the United Nations Organization and United Nations system. Now there is another thing that you should carry with you, as I have advised to you in other open sessions also, that while studying any organization, look at these 2 words, structure and mandate. These are important areas to focus on, and any applied question, even the given one, can be answered through the help of what is it that the organization does and how is it that the organization goes about doing it, right? So this is one question. We will discuss the answers later. Let's look at the second question. Now this is a question that appeared as serial 10, question number 10 in the paper, and the question is: Indian diaspora has a decisive role to play in the politics and economy of America and European countries. Comment with examples. Now this is a question which fairly straightforwardly caters to one clearly mentioned part of the syllabus, Indian diaspora. Now it's very clear that the UPSC in the last few years has asked only 2 questions so far from the diaspora. One was way back in 2017, it was about the contribution of Indians in Southeast Asia. And now the UPSC has asked a question about the Indian diaspora, its role in politics and economy of America and the European countries. Now here what you should understand is, looking at the spread of Indian diaspora across geographies is one aspect of studying diaspora. So here you need to have numbers, you need to have names and areas in which the Indians are in a decisive position, can play a decisive role, and this remains the way you study diaspora. So this was again a pretty straightforward question. Again, a lot of newspaper coverage on this. For example, the Indian Express had come up with the rise of Indian diaspora in United States. And why did this happen? One inspiration was the selection of Kamala Harris, not only as the first woman, not only as the first person of African American descent, but also the first person of Asian and Indian descent to be a part of a major party ticket in the United States presidential elections. So that basically inspired the question. But one basic aspect of India-US relations or India-UK relations has been the large number of people of Indian origin who have been residing in these countries. Now let's look at the next question. Now this is the larger one. Quadrilateral security dialogue is transforming itself into a trade bloc from the military alliance in present times, appearing at serial number 19. Towards the end, if you had applied yourself for chronologically solving the questions, by the time you come to the 19th question, the thinking bandwidth just shrinks. Now the difficulty of this question is twofold: its construction, and secondly the definitiveness that this question displays. Quadrilateral security dialogue is transforming itself into a trade bloc from the military alliance in present times. Now, two things. Whosoever said this question, with due respect, India has categorically always stated that it would never be a part of a military alliance or an alliance system. It's a cardinal position in India's foreign policy. This was stated as much in the month of July by External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar while addressing a conference also. So then the definitive use of term military alliance is problematic, and that's something that I'm trying to flag. Secondly, the Quad itself had never defined itself as a military alliance. So that's the fundamental difficulty as far as I am concerned with this question. But in the examination situation, now this question has been given to you, so then you have to make arguments. If somebody thinks in this way, what are the reasons, what could be the arguments that can be presented to reflect this thinking, and how can one then come to a conclusion whether this is happening, this is not happening, if there are any difficulties in this process. So here also, again, Quad itself has been in news, but the way the question has been formulated sets the difficulty for this question, how to answer this question, right? But in terms of catering to syllabus, your second point in your syllabus is bilateral, regional and global groupings and agreements involving India and or affecting India's interests. So now you can't say that it was out of syllabus. You can, many people would also claim that it was a predictable question, but in this form, it's a difficult case to make if anybody could have predicted that it would come in this form, right? Now the next question again, what is the significance of Indo-US deals over Indo-Russian defense deals discussed with reference to stability in the Indo-Pacific region? Now the term Indo-Pacific has been fashionable, has been in vogue for a very long time, no difficulty there. Indo-US defense deals have been discussed threadbare, no difficulty over that. Indo-Russian defense relations are well known, long-standing, wide-ranging, no difficulties there. But now combining these multiple factors together and then putting it in the form that the question does, the significance of Indo-US deals over Indo-Russian defense deals is at first reading the difficulty therein, right? If you read the Hindi translation, it says tulna mein, which is in comparison with, and when the question comes in English, it's over. So it is sort of giving you an idea that you have to prefer one over the other, right? So that kind of interpretive difficulty may come. However, the idea is that if the construction of the question is difficult, take the simple interpretation and construct your answer with a combination of arguments backed by facts and evidence. That's something that should be your practice going forward. Those of you who have written mains examination, whatever you have written is good. Till the result comes out, just believe in that. Alright, whatever you have written is the answer to this question. Now, in my experience, most of the people logging in are the people who have not written the mains examination, who would be writing the mains examination in the future. So for you, again, my message is, when the construction of the question is difficult, try to have a simple interpretation of it, because who knows that even the person who was setting the questions may not have thought of it in those difficult terms. Right. So let's now try and discuss the answers to these questions. Right. So let's take the first question. Critically examine the role of WHO in providing global health security during COVID-19 pandemic. Now remember, what did I say? I said when you are studying an organization, what you should do is you should focus on the structure and the mandate. Right. So here, what is the mandate of the WHO? Can be your starting point, and you can simply write that the WHO created in 1948 is a key agency within the UN system responsible for promoting global health security with the motto of health for all. WHO has been doing so through the promotion of international documents such as International Health Regulations 2005. The COVID-19 pandemic, now you make a transition. The COVID-19 pandemic presented a situation of global threat to health which required a global response, and hence it was expected that the WHO would play a leading role. To some extent, the role of WHO was in accordance with the expectation with this organization. For example, the declaration of public health emergency of global concern, the declaration of COVID-19 as a global pandemic, the dedicated flow of information through a dashboard on the WHO website, the coordination and sharing of information with member countries, the leadership that the WHO took in creating an alliance for vaccine development, which is called the Solidarity Alliance, Solidarity International Initiative for Vaccines. Now, these are some of the things that the WHO did, which are in confirmation which are in consonance with the role that WHO is supposed to play. Now, you have to critically examine. So then now you would also go and say that there were deficiencies visible, argued about in WHO's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, 3 days ago, the WHO expert panel report has come out, right? When you are writing the examination, that report was not out. So the report under the leadership of Sirleaf Johnson and Helen Clark clearly identifies a delayed response of multiple countries in the case of COVID-19 as a problem, but also it points a finger towards WHO's delayed response. So it is very clear that there were accusations during the COVID-19 pandemic about the delay of WHO in responding. For example, the declaration of public health emergency of global concern was seen to be delayed. The declaration of COVID-19 as pandemic, when the pandemic had spread throughout 113 countries, was seen to be delayed. WHO reason was that the experts were divided on this particular issue. Secondly, the geopolitics visible in WHO's role also became a subject of criticism. For example, United States criticized WHO, threatened to pull out its funding, and ultimately pulled out of WHO. And the haste that the WHO chief displayed arguably in giving a clean chit to China in terms of China setting an example was also widely criticized. Similarly, the information that was available on WHO website also was seen laden with discrepancies, for example, about the animal origins of the COVID-19 crisis. For example, recently the Italian investigators are investigating about a particular document that WHO had put up on its website and later rescinded that particular document. So the information discrepancies were also highlighted, and what was highlighted very simply was that these delays, these information discrepancies, these geopolitical aspects visible in the functioning of the WHO and the questioning on the impartiality of the WHO chief were owing to the structure of the WHO itself. Now the WHO only is a recommendatory body, is a policy setting body. It is dependent on the funding contribution of either member countries or major donors who donate voluntarily. So the criticism of WTO that inherently sticks is that WTO had the experience of previous such crises, for example, the avian influenza crisis or SARS crisis of the early 2003. Despite that, the WHO's response was lacking, which led to the erosion of trust in WHO. However, you would not conclude there. You would have to acknowledge that given the need of multiple countries, least developed countries, of expertise, of availability of medicines, of knowledge, the role of an organization like WHO cannot be undermined. Going forward, what is required is much needed structural reforms within the WHO, especially in its decision making, especially in its expertise, and also the provisions for it to be able to implement its decisions. And WHO needs to be insulated, since health is such a serious concern. WHO needs to be insulated from regional politics, and countries like India, which chaired the Executive Council of WHO in 2020, can play a leading role in this context. All right, so that's the journey that you have to complete. You have to talk about how WHO actually played a role in dissemination of information, in issuing guidelines, in declaring certain milestones which alerted countries about dealing with the pandemic, also leading in the development of solutions, but the criticisms that were also pressed forward. And ultimately, you have to realize that multilateral organizations are not built in one day. There would be criticisms. Any organization is as good, as bad, as strong, as weak as its members make it to be. So your conclusion is not throwing WHO away. Your conclusion is reforms are much needed. This crisis has clearly demonstrated that WHO needs reforms. Now, next question. Next question is again like the WHO question, was an easier question, discussed a lot in the media, in all the public sources that any educated person refers to. Indian diaspora has a decisive role to play in the politics and economy of America and European countries. Comment with examples. Now, here is a question that you can start by setting a context. What kind of context you can set up? Now, here is a question that gives you an opportunity to showcase your awareness. So, you can bring in the data and quotation. So, you can quote the International Migration Report, and you can say that according to the International Migration Report, Indian diaspora with 17 million in number is the largest in the world. And you can also then transition and say that the United States and European countries like UK are one of the most important locations for the Indian diaspora, right? So you have now set the context, you have shown the number. And then you could see that you could bring the classification. You could say that this is what is considered to be new diaspora, which was created by the movement, migration of people in search of opportunity, education, and over the years this diaspora has integrated itself into the societies of America and European countries, and it is playing an important role in its economy as well as politics. All right, you can also add technology. Now you have to then substantiate. How would you substantiate? So you would give the number of America, right? The Indians constitute the highest proportion of foreign born American nationals. The number of Indian diaspora is around 4.8 million, which is about 1.8% of American population, US population. Similarly, you can take some liberty since it says America, not the United States. So you can then bring Canada also, wherein also the number of Indians is more than 1 million, which is now displayed in the economic, political and technological spheres of this continent. So you can now give examples. For example, again, if you see the Indian Express simple news report, it would give you some idea that 1/3 of technological startups in the Silicon Valley are owned by Indians. You can give some of the examples, right? In the business leadership and technological leadership, from Satya Nadella to Sundar Pichai to Vinod Khosla, and any number of examples. American examples are well known. Now you can also say that despite being about 1% of the US population, the median income of American Indians is Indian Americans is or people of Indian origin rather, is higher than the median average American household income, as well as higher than the median income of Asian households in America. And then you can say that even in politics, Indians like Kamala Harris, who became the first senator of Indian origin, Attorney General of California, and now the Vice President of the United States, shows that Indians are playing an important role in the politics of the United States. In the US Congress, as governors of various US states, for example, Nikki Haley and Bobby Jindal had served as governors. So American case is easier to display. You can also give the example of 200,000 students in the American universities bring $8 billion or add $8 billion to United States, and the role of diaspora is acknowledged as a key pillar of India-United States strategic partnership. Now you would come to Europe. Similarly, in Europe, the number of Indians is around 2 million. 1/3 of this number, more than 1/3 of this number is in the UK, right? So in UK again, the 2011 census numbers can be shown that the population of Indians is around 1.8%, but their contribution to UK GDP is 6%, and then the current UK Parliament has 15 members of Indian origin, including cabinet ranking officials in the Boris Johnson administration, like Rishi Sunak as the Chancellor of Exchequer, Preeti Patel as the Home Secretary, and also Alok Sharma as Secretary of Industries. So this also shows Indians playing a leading role in in UK economy. And you can talk about people like Lord Meghnad Saha. You can talk about how companies owned by Indian origin people have a turnover of nearly 40 billion pounds in the United Kingdom, and they are responsible for more than 1,70,000 jobs, employments in the United States. And you can now go to other European countries. So you can say that in countries like Italy, gradually the number of Indians has increased to 200,000, which is largest in Europe in any single country within the mainland Europe. And you can say that Indians are involved in running many businesses in this part of the world. So that is an example that you can give, but more importantly, what example that you can give is in Portugal, where the people of Indian origin are only 70,000 or so in number. The president of Portugal, Antonio Costa, is of Indian origin. Similarly, Leo Varadkar, who is the former Prime Minister of Ireland, is also of Indian origin. Fine Gael is the political party that he belongs to. And then the richest person in Ireland, Palonji Shapurji Mistry, is also of Indian origin. So with these examples you can demonstrate that Indian diaspora has a decisive role to play in the politics of economy and of America and European countries. However, you can, on a note of how to go forward, you can say that in Europe specifically, movement of professionals and migration policy of the European Union needs to be liberalized for Indian skilled labor to play a prominent role in the economy of the European Union. For this, India needs to remain engaged with the European Union, right? So that's something that you can add as a solution going forward, right? Migration and mobility dialogue exists between India and European Union, and India's demand for liberalization of movement of professionals is a key demand within the broad-based trade and investment agreement that India and European Union are negotiating. I can see a question. So Mani Patra, your question is, while playing a leading role in WHO, India was not capable of getting correct information regarding COVID-19. Doesn't it show the inability of WHO working in precautionary measures? Of course, Mani, I don't think there is any contradiction in your understanding and what I said. Of course, there are weaknesses in how WHO worked, and information flow is something that I had clearly mentioned. Now, again, remember, when you are writing the examination, your tone should not be accusatory. Your tone should be analytical, that you have observed this thing and you are solution oriented also. So that's why criticism, but also contribution, and also the hope that WHO needs reform, because multilateral organizations are not built in one day. If you know anything about India's foreign policy, you know that India still believes in multilateralism, no matter what anyone's personal beliefs are, but that's a cardinal part of India's foreign policy. So that's the answer to your question, Mani Patra. Now, moving forward, let's look at an interesting question, which is, the quadrilateral security dialogue is transforming itself into a trade bloc from the military alliance in present times. Discuss. So how would you start with this question? Now, starting the answer to this question is easy. It's very simple. You would define what Quad is, though the Quad lacks any official definition, right? It lacks any official definition. But to the best of your understanding, how would you define and contextualize Quad? You can say that the quadrilateral security dialogue is a convergence-based partnership of 4 key democracies in the Indo-Pacific, namely India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. These countries, apart from shared values like democracy, have a common view of ensuring a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific. And strategically, as the current events have further highlighted, the rise of China is a common question that these countries are looking for a response for. Now, the Quad traditionally has been seen revolving around interactions on security and strategic scenarios in the region, starting in the cooperation between these countries in the 2004 tsunami, in the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations, to the revival of this dialogue in 2017 in the face of increasing assertiveness of China. This is how primarily the Quad has been seen. However, the divergent views of countries participating in this engagement also means that its agenda has remained undefined. Thus, that's why it has been argued by many, now you would say it has been argued by many, that either the Quad needs to transform itself into a trade bloc, or it is in the process of doing so. This can be further substantiated by, how would you substantiate it? Now you would have to bring in some numbers. Now, you have to bring in some details as to this particular aspect. What are the details that you will talk about? The COVID-19 crisis indicated towards a global economy, a global economic supply chain which is dependent on China. All these countries have their own complex set of economic and trade issues with China. So in the post-COVID-19 recovery, for the post-COVID-19 recovery, as well as diversification of supply chains, the efforts of these countries are much required. Unified approach of these countries is much required, is something that you can write. And this is also visible in the work for a supply chain resilience initiative between India, Japan and Australia. Similarly, the Chinese BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, has key geo-economic implications. As a response, these countries seem to be moving towards developing mechanisms to counter such initiatives like Belt and Road Initiative by providing better options. So the Blue Dot Initiative, which is an infrastructure certification initiative by Australia, Japan and the United States, seems to be a move in this direction. Similarly, you can also argue that, as is seen, many of these countries are close partners in economic engagements. For example, bilaterally, India has a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with Japan, and it is in the process of negotiating a comprehensive economic cooperation agreement with Australia. Australia and Japan are parts of RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and the United States remains a key trading partner of these countries. Now, why this particular question, to the best of my understanding, may have been asked? Because there have been simulations by people writing academic papers who have imagined scenarios wherein if tariffs are brought down by these countries together, the Quad bloc in the Indo-Pacific, what would happen is that it's visible that there would be clear benefits to all the countries in terms of trade. So for example, paper appearing in Journal of Economic Structure this year in 2020 posited that if tariffs are removed by these four countries, India's actual GDP, real GDP, would increase by 0.23%. All right, there would be an increase of 0.23% in India's real GDP. Similarly, India's exports would rise by 2.8%. So the economic logic of cooperation has also been highlighted by many. Now you can also see that these countries constitute among themselves one of the most important trading countries and most important economies as part of the G20, all right, group of 20. Now I have to give you some numbers. These countries together constitute for 1.8 billion of people. So it's a large market. These countries together contribute 30 trillion US dollars as global GDP. Their combined total GDP is 30 trillion US dollars. Similarly, their trade among themselves is 440 billion US dollars, which is a large percentage of global trade. And their trade with the rest of the world is 6 trillion US dollars. So these are important trading economies, and if they come together, they can create an important trading bloc. And this possibility has been indicated by academic papers, by observers. And the other idea is that separately these countries are committed to trade liberalization. They are members of groupings like APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, wherein Japan, Australia and United States are members. However, now you will bring a caveat. For such a scenario to materialize, what is required is greater institutionalization and definition of the agenda of Quad. Similarly, India's participation in APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, must be ensured by other members of the Quad for the idea of a Quad economic bloc to materialize. These countries also need to work on resolving their differences, wherein India's trade remains stagnant with Japan And during the Trump administration, there were differences on trade issues between India and United States. So, though there is much potential of Quad as a trade bloc, it needs to be defined, it needs to be institutionalized. And that's something that is very clear, that should be your approach. And that is how you can argue the best about this question, bringing in numbers, bringing in the potential, bringing in some dialogues, initiatives, either in which more than one country or one country is involved. You have to bring in the differences also. India is not part of RCEP. Similarly, I think anybody who made this question should have looked at the speech of External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar, should have looked at this speech. How does India's External Affairs Minister refer to the Quad meeting that took place in 2020 at Tokyo, the second ministerial meeting? The External Affairs Minister refers to this meeting as India, United States, Japan, Australia consultation on regional and global issues. There is no mention of alliance, there is no mention of Quad security dialogue. The reference is consultation, all right. Australia, Japan, India, United States, consultation on regional and global issues. So, this approach should have informed the question. It did not, but you have enough information about Quad, you had to construct an answer. Going forward, whenever you are studying, reading something, have some numbers when you find them to make arguments of magnitude, right? What are arguments of magnitude? Arguments of magnitude are combined, what is the worth of the GDP of these countries, combined how much trade do they conduct with each other, combined how much trade do they conduct with the global market, global economy, all right. Similarly, some institutional information, where exactly are these countries engaging apart from the Quad format, all right. So, these are the things that you should also pay key attention to. In international relations, there is great uncertainty, things keep on changing. So, a definitive approach is something that does not serve our purpose. As if you would see, Dr. Jaishankar's recent book says that in the complex and a world which is in flux, the convergence based coalitions, these are the terms that are used, not alliances, convergence based coalitions is what India is participating in, from Quad to SCO, from RIC, Russia, India, China, to JAI. Right? So, that is what India is doing, dealing with a complex world where there is much uncertainty. So, you should be prepared to make arguments rather than have a strict view about any particular relation or a preference for Quad or any other fascinating or fashionable terminologies. All right, know the basics and you would be able to answer the question. Right? So, this was your answer on this question. Next question, right? Another interesting question is, what is the significance of Indo-US deals over India-Russia defense deals? Discuss with reference to stability in the Indo-Pacific region. Right. Now, there are two clear aspects to this question, two clear factual aspects that you should be aware of. Are you aware of the Indo-US defense deals? Are you aware of the Indo-Russia defense deals? So, factual awareness is there in most of the students, right? Everybody knows that India is buying S-400 from Russia. India has signed LEMOA, COMCASA or SISMOA, BECA with the United States, the foundational agreements. Now, the actual import of these agreements is something that may be missing in terms of comprehension, right? So, this answer requires a clear understanding of India, USA defense deals, and in what areas would you see this expanding to, right? It includes defense procurement, meaning the equipments that we buy. It includes foundational agreements, meaning the legal status of these agreements for India to be a major defense partner of the United States, a process which is ongoing. If you do business with United States, it has to be a long drawn negotiated process. That's what's happening between these two countries. And it also involves the idea of co-design and co-production, which means DTTI, Defense Technology Trade Initiative. These are the three pillars of India-US defense deals. In the case of India and Russia, you have the defense procurement, you have licensed and joint production, and the process of extensive or expansion, let's say expansion of defense beyond production and procurement, is an ongoing process. For example, if you are reading news, you would realize that India and Russia were in the process of finalizing a mutual logistical support agreement, which would have allowed India to access logistical facilities of Russian armed forces and Russia to access logistical facilities of Indian armed forces. The summit between India and Russia was postponed. This year it did not take place, so that agreement was not signed. Now here is Indo-Pacific. The context is Indo-Pacific, right? So that basically gives the direction to your answer. Now clearly Indo-Pacific is a US term. Clearly Russia views Indo-Pacific as a US strategy, right? So now, without making these two relations collide with each other, because India's attempt is to preserve its traditional partnerships like with Russia and expand its newer partnerships like with the United States. So what you would see is that India as a key player in the Indo-Pacific arena, and also facing one of the key destabilizing issues in this region, which is the unilateral assertion and aggression of China, requires to bolster its defense preparedness. And in this external balancing, its defense agreements with the United States are paving a foundation of a long-lasting partnership, wherein it is seen that in recent times defense procurement from the United States has bolstered India's air capabilities in terms of procurement of Apache helicopters or the Hercules or Globemaster transport planes or the Poseidon amphibian planes. The foundational agreements between India and United States are laying the foundation for informational exchange, exchange of secure data links, exchange of geospatial information, satellite based information, wherein the US has unparalleled capabilities. Similarly, the US has bases around the globe, including in the Pacific region, where in the South China Sea, increasing belligerence of China has also direct and indirect implications for India. So India benefits from that. Similarly, what you would see is the designation of India as a major defense partner would ensure a sustainable partnership with the United States, which is not the case traditionally. And this is happening on the basis of geostrategic convergence on the question of the Indo-Pacific. Similarly, India's ambitions of defense strengthening should not only remain external, meaning based on defense procurements. India also aims to improve its defense posturing by modernization and indigenization of manufacturing, wherein the DTTI initiative, if taken forward swiftly, can enable industry to industry partnership between the two sides, which is also facilitated by the STA-1 status provided to India in 2018 and the Industrial Security Annex signed between the two sides in 2019. Now, how would you bring Russia? Having said that, relations with Russia have traditionally been supported by robust defense cooperation. It remains largest defense supplier of India, and India's commitment to take this relationship forward is seen in its insistence on acquiring S-400 air defense system despite the threats of sanction under countering of America's adversaries under the Sanctions Act, all right, through Sanctions Act. India seems to be on the path of balancing its global relations, wherein it would like to preserve and strengthen its partnership with Russia, as well as go ahead with diversification of its relations with the United States. However, on the question of the Indo-Pacific, there remains a gulf between these two important partners of India, bridging which remains a much arduous task for India, which can be done through the possibility of a trilateral dialogue. However, much depends on, now by the time you had written the examination, the Trump administration was on its way out and the Biden administration was coming in. Much depends on the approach of the incoming Biden administration. Alright, so you don't have to reject one relation and prefer one, but you have to clearly demonstrate the merit of relations with United States in detail, and also mention or know the importance of relations with Russia, right? Russia is of clear view that United States is pressurizing India and trying to undermine Russia-India relations. Some people in India, there are two kinds of views, that Russia is a traditional and old and natural friend, and US is a traditional and natural friend. Now there are limitations to both these arguments. These decisions about India's foreign policy should be taken not on what is Russia's interest, what is US interest, but on the basis of India's national interest, and diversification is what is in our national interest, right? So for example, while the LSA benefits India, all right, or LEMOA, Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, which is a foundational agreement, India does not have global ambitions like United States. So US is in much more better position to benefit from such agreements. Similarly, what you would see is, it is argued that US technologies, US defense equipments are expensive as compared to Russian ones. Similarly, what is argued is that if you see, Russia is providing some of the most important, strategically significant, strategically game-changing equipments to India. For example, S-400 is considered to be best in its class, and the agreement between India and Russia worth $3 billion US, wherein Russia would be providing nuclear attack submarines. Now, the maritime domain that India needs to strengthen again would require the cooperation in submarine technology with Russia. So both of these are important partners. That is something that you should not forget. Highlight the significance and the key aspects of India-US defense deals. Remember the conception of Indo-Pacific and differences between between Russia and United States, but also remember these are two important relations for India. So there is a need for bridging, there is a need for greater clarity, and in international relations there are no clear solutions. There is always engagement wherein differences have to be sorted out, and we expect that things would be better, all right, and till possible we would not choose between two partners. We would like to keep these friendships, all right. So that's the way you address these questions. Last two questions were difficult in terms of their construction. You needed to build arguments. First two questions were relatively straightforward, much discussed throughout the year, but overall what can be said is that pattern remains the same: 50 questions, 50 marks, 4 questions, and that is something that we can bring from here. But whenever you are reading, read carefully, note down important data pieces are important to build arguments, understand things into their fundamentals, and most importantly understand what are the basics of India's foreign policy. What is it that India stands for? What is it that India argues for? right? As it is said, there are no permanent friends or permanent enemies, there are only permanent national interests. Similarly, as Dr. Jaishankar has said, these days foreign policy is much about convergence based coalitions, all right. So, horses for courses is what we look for, what benefits us and how can we increase the benefits and how can we minimize any pitfalls of any equation or any triangulation of equations, right. So, that is something that you should keep in mind while preparing for international relations. So, that was the discussion on international relations. Stay tuned for the next section of social justice related issues. Hopefully, this was helpful. All the best wishes going forward.